Hello and welcome to another edition of Gray Matter. I'm your host, Leighton Gray, spiritual gangster. My clothing is furnished by our wonderful sponsor, pureathletics.ca. That's PUUR athletics.ca. Lots of great stuff on their webpage you'll find, including Corksicle products, which I'm drinking from today. We have another really interesting guest today. A very courageous Canadian woman we're going to be talking to. I've researched her, and I think by the time we get into this conversation, you're going to start to realize, the depth and the breadth of her ideas and how important, how prescient they are, not only for Canada, but globally. Her name is Susan Standfield. So, as you know, we always frame our discussions in terms of quotation or aphorism. Today's show is entitled "Betrayed" because that is the title of Susan's most recent book, which I highly recommend you read. I borrowed today's quotation, the first one, actually from one that was posted on one of Susan's websites, and it's from Benjamin Disraeli, who's a conservative prime minister, really one of the founders of the modern Conservative Party, who was Prime Minister of England from 1868 to 1875 and 1880. He's a novelist before he was Prime Minister, and so he's often quoted because he was a brilliant prose writer. The quotation is, "Courage is fire and bullying is smoke." Another quotation we have from today's guest is this: "I really had no idea so many Canadian mothers felt as betrayed as I did by our lawmakers, so I decided to speak out for all of us. They were afraid, but I wasn't." She also wrote, 36 million Canadians were betrayed by every level of our governments for 2 years. My story is your story, and it's time we initiate criminal investigations to charge those responsible for destroying our country. So today we have Susan Standfield joining us. Susan has been one of the loudest voices in uncovering corruption during the pandemic in British Columbia, Canada, and she's a longtime activist for health and justice. Her experience living in Africa and abroad have given her unique insight into health, fraud, and genocide. Susan has recently was involved in the Leighton, BC, where a fire decimated an entire town. And we're going to talk about some of her ideas about truth, justice, and the future on today's show. So first of all, let's find out a little bit more about our guest. She says on one of her own web pages, where she describes herself as growing up in 1970s Vancouver in a neighborhood called Shaughnessy, where her father also grew up in the 1940s, 5 blocks away. She says her English ancestors, the Toll Puddle Martyrs, inspired both the trade union and the suffragette movement by standing up for labor rights in Toll Puddle, Dorset, England, post-French Revolution. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Queen's University at Kingston and has lived and worked all over Africa. She's a mom of 2 and currently is living in England. On April 12th, 2020, she started the No More Lockdowns marches in Vancouver and designed T-shirts to replace the income of that her family lost from public health crimes in BC. She also designs justice to inspire women and moms to step into leadership in their own authentic and unique way. Susan has also been designing, curating, and broadcasting daily justice videos on her social channel since 2018 to empower women and moms to find their own unique health justice leadership style. She says that when she started blowing the whistle on health justice in Canada, she quickly realized huge numbers of people needed to understand the complex human rights and governance issues that she learned over a 20-year career in advocacy, and that if we were ever going to stop the powerful cartels who are profiting off the downgrading of our natural health every day, these injustices are far too big for a few leaders, but with millions of women and moms all over the world fighting to protect our children, we're finally making progress thanks to COVID crimes that were a massive wake-up call. She calls herself a flak jacket activist because she's usually first in taking the bullets on a difficult issue that most people don't know about or are afraid to talk about. She worked in American TV, and she had a series in advertising for 10 years, from 1993 to 2003. And she created her first TV project in Nairobi, Kenya in 2007. She 3 years later, in 2011, she met her British husband was kidnapped by Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. When we lived there at the start of the when she lived there as part of during the 5 Arab uprisings. She says that everyone told me the story sounded like a movie, so I started developing a TV series about it called Uprising. While doing so, she created 3 more series concepts based on other experiences, living and working all over the world, called Edible Planet, Dissident Wives, and Gulakani Rose. She says, like most writers, she starts the day with writing and design, illustrating her stories with her own photography. Let's meet this woman. I've given you whet your appetite. I guess you can see why we really wanted to have her on the show. We're going to talk to her about her book, but we're going to talk about a wide range of subjects. As you can see, she sort of has a polymathic background, and we're going to ask her some questions and try to pick her brain about some of these issues that are obviously of great importance to her. Welcome to the show, Susan. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, it's an honor and a privilege. Thank you. And I must admit, you have a way better background than I do. I love
So you're with us from England today, right?
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock. I'm in northern England, just in the countryside outside Manchester, in between Manchester and Liverpool. So I'm about an hour from the North Sea and the ferry to Ireland.
And I saw from your biography that your husband is British, but you also have English roots going back many generations. Is that right?
Yeah. So like lots of Canadians, I would be the old white stock, right? That's what Trudeau says. So my paternal great relatives came in 1840 and settled in London, Ontario. Those are the famous activists. And then my maternal side came by boat from Scotland in 1923 and settled in Ottawa.
So is that where you grew up in Ottawa, or did you live in British Columbia when you were growing up?
Yeah, I grew up in Vancouver. So my paternal side, they sort of went west. My grandfather was the first family member to work for the Hudson's Bay. We were in retail in Toronto, phonographic music retail. And then he got into the Hudson's Bay network and went all the way from London to Vancouver and stopped there. And he managed the big Hudson's Bay in Vancouver. He died when my father was very young, but we never left Vancouver. Most of my extended family lived there.
So what drew you out east to go to university? What did you study while you were in Kingston?
That's such a great question. My mother, she influenced so much of my life. She grew up in Ottawa. And she said, you got to get out of here and live in a different part of Canada and meet other people and, expand your horizons. So when I was 17, it was common for grade 11 students to be introduced to the universities of Canada. And back then you applied to 3. It's probably still the same, right? So I had the privilege of, she took me on a trip and we went to see Western, Queen's, and McGill. And a very old friend of ours who actually built the Aritzia fashion chain, she was at Queen's. And the day I was having a tour, she drove by in the back of a station wagon with a bunch of friends drinking beer, and they were on the way to a football game. And she said, "Hey, it's Sue." And I said to my mom, "I want to go to Queen's. I want to go here," because it sounded fun. And it was. Queens was a ball back then. It was crazy, the partying that happened. I went in 1986. That's when I started.
We would have started university around the same time then. So what did you study while you were there? What was the focus of your education?
Oh, God. Well, my mom died right then when that happened. And my dad said, just graduate, just study anything. Just spend half the time in the pub, enjoy yourself, and pursue intellectual, I'll tell you about that Western philosophy. My father's a lawyer, and he said, make sure you enjoy that part and just come out with anything. I really don't care. It's about being in a university that he wanted me to have, and my mother did too. So I picked politics because my first class, my teacher was fascinating. And he taught us about, in the first class, he said, if you don't like the chairs, you have to complain to the school and get better chairs. And he was very activist, kind of. He was an Indian, a very old sort of Indian guy. And so I ended up with the political science degree, but I studied Italian. I studied international political relations, the Canadian government system. And then my favorite was philosophy and the Western thinkers like Plato and Hegel and Nietzsche and all the thought. But I was really young. I was 17 when I started, and I was drunk for the first 2 years, basically, because of Queens. And I was really messed up because of losing my mom. So I just barely got out with a degree. I mean, I had a C+B average the whole time. I did not focus the way kids now have to. I don't know if it was like that for you, but there wasn't such a focus on academics for me. It was more just to expand my thought.
Yeah, it sounds like you got the sort of liberal arts education that was very much in vogue at that time, but does not seem to be the norm anymore. And I would say that you and I were both fortunate to go through the university, especially studying in the humanities. For example, before sort of all this woke ideology really took over the university, I recall it being there to some degree. We were aware of it. We certainly studied things like Marxism and modernism and postmodernism, but it had not taken over university and dominated academia to the point it does today, where I'm sure you hear this as well. Many students who are at the universities now actually have to hide the fact that they have, let's say, conservative political views, and actually have to tailor their academic work in order to achieve, fair grades from instructors who are primarily leftist and left-leaning, and they actually grade accordingly. So I don't know about you, but I feel rather grateful that I went through university during that time frame when sort of that wokeness, diversity, inclusion, equity, CRT wave had not fully taken over academia as it clearly has now.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I would be going to Queen's University if I was 18 years old now. I think I would be headed towards a trade or business, or I mean, it was just kind of an era back then. It's almost an era, as you say, like that it's kind of over. It really was about, especially the family that I grew up in. I come from, not a wealthy family or anything, but just a very, social-minded sort of justice, be a part of the community. And it was really about giving me a way to expand my thought process to set me up for living a more fulfilling, meaningful life. And I had to pay for a lot of my expenses. I had to work. My father covered the school costs, but I had to pay for everything else. So I worked a lot, and I worked all the summer to make the money to pay my rent and stuff like that.
It sounds as though your father was a very strong influence in your life, although he never quite got you to enter the law. Having said that, your interests, your interests obviously touch on a lot of legal issues, though, don't they? In terms of you've been a worldwide, a global activist, really, on a number of issues, and so a lot of what interests you is obviously, taking apart and challenging some of these legal conventions and ideas where the law intersects with individual freedom and culture. At least that's my sense from looking at some of your history, from some of your personal and professional biography. So it sounds like your father was a strong influence, but he didn't quite convince you to enter the law.
Well, kind of the opposite, actually. I would say my mother was more of an influence around that. She grew up in the church, and she was always the one who was just, what is fair? Be what is fair and do what is fair. And I didn't understand the more complicated aspect of how you explained it when I was younger. My father kind of ended up as a corporate lawyer, and he was with one of the big downtown Vancouver firms, right? And was successful and a senior partner and stuff. And he said, no, don't be a lawyer. He goes, it's boring. It's like being on a railway track. And he was in the corporate thing, work the lot hours, bill the high billing rates, pay the rent of the law firm model. So he wasn't really doing it. Those days changed in the 80s and 90s. All that changed when he was heading towards retirement. So he said, go and do something totally different. And so I hitchhiked across Australia, and he thought that was fantastic. He said, go do that.
Great. So what did you do after you got out of university? Where did you go? What did you do? You mentioned you went to Australia. So did you do a lot of traveling after you completed your university education?
A lot of international traveling. I wanted to be a war photographer. I wanted to be a documentary war photographer, and I had studied the Magnum Photo Collective, which is Robert Capa, and you probably know the famous pictures of Robert Capa, the Spanish Civil War.
Yes.
But I didn't have the wherewithal or the mentorship to get to that first step. So I needed to get to New York and train with them, and I needed about $5,000 and a way to live in New York or whatever. And I didn't come from that kind of a family. I didn't know anybody there. We didn't have the kind of money to do that. If my mother hadn't died, she would have probably taken me there and helped me. So that window of opportunity went away, and then I went into the TV industry. But I really wanted to just grab my lenses. I had lenses and cameras, and I wanted to just jump on planes and travel around the world and document what I saw, not just war, but I was inspired to understand what was going on in the world. And I thought, if I can photograph it, if I can document it, then I'll be able to understand it, and I can also share it with people. So
using
I'm glad that
as
didn't
a
happen.
photography as a
Anyway.
way to tell, right? So
Yeah.
using photography as a way to tell stories.
Well, and it's justice, right? It's truth, because when you take a photograph, unless you're going to doctor it, it's the truth. And I learned that at Queen's,
Right.
because I was so heartbroken with my mother dying, and she had given me a camera before she died, and I just photographed everybody and everything. And that everybody will say that about me. Oh yeah, Sue, she was always with her camera. And it just gave me a way to enter society, because I was really sad and young, and it gave me an identity, and it was cool. It was a cool thing to do. And so I became a photographer. It gave me a purpose, and I didn't have some big career goal. I wasn't there to become an accountant. I wasn't on my way to business school. I really had no direction. And I was a year younger than everybody, because back then Ontario did grade 13. So the camera gave me a way to become sort of my first self, my first adult self. And it's given me purpose and meaning ever since. I've never lost the passion for it.
So you started your life in photography when you went off to college, when you went to university.
Yeah, I joined the camera club. I was in the darkroom all the time, that kind of stuff. But I just was photographing. I was doing portraits, and I was trying to figure out, if I'd been serious about it and gotten down to New Yorker, I probably would have been a great editorial, journalist photographer. I had that eye, but nobody did that back then from a family that I came from. It was weird. I was a woman, and so I wasn't even offered those opportunities back then. It's, sort of no man's land when you're a woman who was born in the 60s and 70s. So I just pieced together a career just doing whatever, and just got offered jobs. And so I just took these jobs, and they always ended up in TV and film and media.
So when did your photographs start to get noticed and published?
I held my first personal exhibit about the history of Chinatown in Vancouver when in about 1993, and I sold everything. Everything sold out. And the Chinese community interviewed me and gave me some status in the community. They were fascinated that this white woman was hunting around the back streets, photographing the fishmongers and stuff. And that was something I could have sort of jumped and built on and gone in a different direction. I won an award out of Toronto. I went down to California, but I never perceived it to be, I didn't see the avenue as clearly. It was still but I could never really do it successfully. It was always just this kind of a hobby thing, and probably because I hadn't had the education. If I'd gone to photojournalism school or something, I didn't have that. I just had a BA in politics. I had my own cameras, and I was just trying to pay the rent, basically.
Well, by the same token, it's also, I'm sure this has occurred to you, it's possible that if you'd gone down the formal education route, you would have been producing pictures that were more like what everybody else was doing, as opposed to sort of the unique cultural pictures that you were producing when you're photographing Chinatown. So I suppose that there's different ways of looking at that. It's a fascinating feature of history that a lot of the most unique artists do not come out of formal schools. And I think part of that, I was an English major in university, and I found that most of the time when we were studying things like poetry and novels, we were sort of wringing them like wet towels, trying to get all of the intellectual theory out of it, and sort of wringing them for their ideas instead of really appreciating them for what they actually were, and that is artifacts, works of art. And I don't know if you agree with this, but I found that sometimes formal study in things like in arts, like photography or literature or music, often leads someone to become a critic. And there are so many of those. But you don't see many artists come out of that sort of critical school. There are exceptions, someone like George Bernard Shaw, for example. And there are journalists like Ernest Hemingway who become great novelists and writers. But oftentimes, you just have, for example, someone like Joseph Conrad, never heard a word of English until he was 19 years of age. He was a merchant seaman. And he became one of the greatest English novelists. So that's just an aside, but we do go down some of these tunnels on the show. So
well,
you're
I tell
forewarned.
You, yeah, what the gift that it's given me the most of, and this is why I would say to people, or especially young people, get a camera. I mean, we all have cameras on our phones, but really focus on it. And back then it was different because you had to make every shot count because I was using film, and you pay for the film and you got to get the film exposed and stuff, right? So what it taught me the most of, and I still use it now, is that there are so many different perspectives of how to see something. So I could photograph a barge of logs 3 different ways, and you would end up with kind of 3 different opinions because of how you would photograph it and how you would see it. You'd see it from the front, you'd see it from above, you'd see it from behind, and you'd see all the pollution in the oil of the engine. So you can tell the story of the barge of logs in 3 different ways. And it really has been a gift because it's opened my eyes to so many different types of opinions and perspectives, because I've seen the world from so many different angles because I've photographed it from so many different angles. And I was always drawn to people and different cultures, and you have to talk to them. If you're going to really get a good story, you have to get close. And Kappa talks about that. And so I know a lot about a lot of the things I've photographed. And that's probably why I was able to start the marches, is I had a very deep understanding of the world because of choices I had made as a younger person. My eyes were very open. I was very aware to a perspective that other people might not have been.
Well, I want to talk about some of your activism and, of course, your book. But before we go there, this may seem obvious to you, but I'm curious about the transition from a photographer to a filmmaker. How did that occur? How did that happen?
Well, I was trying to make some money and pay the rent. And it was all going fine, but I hadn't kind of jumped up to a level of being I was hanging out with all the photographers in Vancouver, and they were all making their way, getting studios or being fashion photographers. And I hadn't picked my niche. And I was just tired of struggling and just not having much every month, right? And I was on my own, living in whatever. And a friend of mine, a friend of a friend, introduced me to a very powerful entertainment executive named Sam Feldman, and you may know that name. And he offered me a job. And so I started working in the entertainment industry, and I was like, this is really cool. And I could photograph all the concerts. So I just ended up in a really high-paced entertainment industry. And I left the music side. I wanted to go into TV and film. Someone else offered me a job working for the Californian television executives that were starting to invest in Vancouver back then. That's when the whole industry began. And I was just one of the people that I was lucky I was out there on my surfboard, and the big wave of television industry built in Vancouver. And I rode that wave for about 8 years, all through like 93 to 2001. I was working constantly, making a lot of money and working on interesting projects. I was in the office. I was more in the finance. I worked with writers and stuff like that, but it's still imaginative and creative. So it was a good career. I'm glad I left, but it was a fun ride for 8 years.
Well, one of the things I must ask you about is the story involving your husband and he's being kidnapped and how you turned that into, a muse really to develop this TV series called Uprising. Could you tell us a little bit about that? This is a really intriguing story.
Well, it's funny because I knew that there was going to be, like, the whole COVID and what we see now with these movements around the world. I could feel it because I was living in Africa for many years, and I witnessed the Arab uprisings beginning. The young people criticizing the government for the first time, the internet was coming in, all that. I could see the destabilization of these ancient cultures. And I had been photographing it as well. I was living on the beach in Tripoli with my husband, and he was working. And so when he got kidnapped, and I was the one that found him, and there was ransom, and like the whole thing is right out of a movie. We ended up telling that story to our friends for years. We were living in Cape Town. We had to go back to England. I had a baby. Like the whole thing was just like jaw dropping. And every person who we told the story to said, that sounds like a movie. And so finally my husband said, yeah, we should make a movie. I said, well, I will do it then, because he's not going to do it. He doesn't have the background or the interest, but I'm a writer. So we decided a couple of years ago, just before COVID hit, that we would move back to England. And one of the main things I would do, because my kids were older a little bit, they weren't babies anymore, I would try and hustle some interest in this as a TV series, not a movie, as a series, because I know series and there's more money in series. And what you pitch basically is 5 seasons. That's how you pitch a series. 10 episodes, 5 seasons. That's the Netflix model. That's 50 hours of television. And these buyers from all over the world are looking for great stories. And a lot of them are really based in true stories. The most interesting ones are based in true stories. So we were just about to do that. I was starting to meet with production companies, and then the lockdown started. And I literally had to put everything on hold for 2 years.
Okay, so that's a great segue into your book. And I understand this is not your first book, though, is it? You've written a previous one, right?
I've written 2 other books, but I didn't sell them or publish them. One of them was a memoir to my mother, and another was a journal, basically, of living in Africa for 4 years studying trade. It was called Trade Not Aid. And I worked with a lot of development groups and kids and stuff. It was just more of a journal. I photographed and wrote everything every day of what I saw, but I never did anything with it other than inform myself, and I created work opportunities for myself. I was one of the world's first bloggers. I think I was on Blogger. You remember Blogger when it started?
Oh, yes.
2005. I moved to Nairobi, and my friend helped me set up a Blogger account. So I went to cafes every day, and I wrote stories on Blogger with my photographs. Right. I would load a photo and something I photographed in Nairobi, and then I would write a story about it. I did that for 4 years.
So we talked about your photography. We talked about your filmmaking. You're also involved in fashion design. You've got your own line of clothing and T-shirts, and you're also a writer. So when did you get the writing bug? When did writing become a big part of your life? Was that while you were in Africa?
I think I got good at the writing with all the years of television and constantly being on computers. And I worked with writers. My first job was editing the script on a movie with Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon and all these guys. And I was hired to be the writer's assistant. And I was like, I can do this. And they hired me because I understood the computers. Nobody knew how to use the computer in the office, and I did. So I became the writer's assistant, and I knew that there was money in writing. So I wrote a lot through television, and it was just part of the job. You get hired to do something, and writing was part of the job, producing huge amounts of documents and books and sending them all over the country for shoots and stuff. But my first real decision to write my story was when I moved to Africa, and I wrote that Trade Not Aid series. And it wasn't fancy writing. It was just literally documentary stories every day. It was about 700 or 800 words every day, pretty much, that I wrote. And then people started reading it and commenting. And that's when the internet kind of became something, and people could find my stories, or people would interview me. And I just knew that people related to my voice and the way I told the story.
Well, I think that's also true of your book. So let's start with this. It's a very in-your-face title. It's very stark, Betrayed.
Yeah, you want to see the cover?
And I'm sure that's by design. Right. So we already have an idea that
or white.
There's going to be stories about betrayal in the book. But why did you choose that particular title, and sort of take us into the book itself? Why did you choose that title for the book?
Well, funny, by default, I didn't. It was my husband's idea.
Oh, okay.
And the title itself, we decided that I would write a book about what happened to me. And one of the sort of titles I had come up with was anti-masker, because that's how I had been branded. And it was a very sexy photo, and I was leaning over, and it said anti-masker in like lipstick color pink. And it was edgy and interesting, and it probably would have been a great book that way. But it didn't have the story about what happened to all Canadians. It was just my own personal story. And he read a book that was written by Ian Smith, who was the president or prime minister of Rhodesia, which is the former Zimbabwe, and he grew up there. And it was called The Great Betrayal, how the world really kind of betrayed the history of Rhodesia before it was forced into the war, the Revolutionary War, into black rule. Very, very old, interesting story. And he said The Great Betrayal. And he said, and I said, I love that word, betrayal. And so I said, I'm going to call it Betrayed. And that's how we all felt. I mean, I get what I want to speak for you, but so many of us felt every single day the sense of betrayal. How can they do this to us? How can they shut the schools? How can they force this? And it was just betrayal, betrayal, betrayal. And it was a word that lent itself to other types of relationships. I had friends who betrayed me, the government betraying us, Starbucks betraying you. Right?
Oh yeah.
So that's where we got it. It was my husband's idea.
So that reminds me of a book that I read recently by Conrad Black called The Canadian Manifesto. I don't know if you've read that book, but first of all, it's a very optimistic book in the sense that Mr. Black basically says that if the conditions in Canada were right, if they were proper, if we were properly governed, Canada would be set up to be really a world superpower, perhaps one of the 2 or 3 richest countries in the world. And of course, recent events have shown that that to be somewhat prophetic opinion. But he also said something that really corroborates what you just said, and that is that in Canada, for the longest time, this is his view, and I happen to agree with it. We've been somewhat spoiled in that, with a few exceptions, we've been very well governed in Canada. We've never really had a situation like we have now, where so many people feel as though the government is working against us. That we have this sense of betrayal. The government is supposed to be our servant, and now it's our master. And that's part of, I think, what you're writing about. But what I'd like to maybe get you to talk about next, Susan, is what specific events occurred in your life, and perhaps in the public forum, that inspired you to write the book.
Good question. Well, I was always saying to the people in our movement from day one, take pictures, do video, write stories, because creating a public record of a great injustice is very important. Like, you may know the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the murdered and missing Indigenous women. It's very important to create public records for justice. So
we did a whole show on that recently, actually.
Oh, okay, yeah.
With Dr. Rodney Clifton. So when it comes out, I hope people will take that in.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
And that's a tool that's very accessible for so many people. We can all engage in that. So I did expect that some people would start to come out with things like little movies or books or whatever. And my friend published a book, Lani Galari, called The Brave, and I wrote the foreword to it. And everybody loved it. And people wanted to interview me about my writing of the foreword. And I thought, okay, I should do something too. And then I realized I have to write my story, because I became so well known. I was recognized every day on the street eventually, because I did so many videos and all these attacks in the media. So that's what inspired me to realize that I could transition from this, make an ass of myself as a protester, into a much more mainstream voice to talk about the kind of issues that you're talking about now, that we would get to this place. So 2 years ago when I started, there was nothing. There was no gray matter. There was no Zoom interviews. We had no infrastructure to our movement whatsoever. And I thought, okay, if I can come up with something like this that tells my story in a way that is very bold and true, the betrayal, but has an elegance to it, I can help, like Devin was saying, the guy that works with you, I can help reach the 60% of Canadians who are really good people and who want a better country and can make it happen for us, but they need to hear the message in a way that's digestible. And so that's why I designed it to look like this. It's something that can sit on a lady's bedside table or a coffee table, and it can become a story that's more mainstream for all of us, because it happened to all of us.
So you drew obviously on your experience as a photographer, even down to designing the cover of the book.
Yeah, and I had worked for on and off in publishing projects, so I know how a book is designed. I know and I read a lot. But what I had done, and I don't really talk about the story very much because not everybody understands it, but I created a brand of myself, of the Susan Standfield activist brand, right? I knew exactly what I was doing. This wasn't an accident. I made a story about a woman, a mom who was fed up and wanted to communicate the real essence of the betrayal. And so that's why you always see me in my channels and people go, oh, she's so narcissist, whatever. I built a personal brand. I have a branding background through television and all that. And I knew that if women could relate to one woman who just looked normal, I don't look like a crazy activist. I look like someone you'd see just in the grocery store, that they would relate and they would go, I feel that way too. And so I'm going to follow her and I'm going to listen to what she's saying. And I've always advocated for people to be courteous and professional, because that's the marathon of the justice, not the sprint necessarily, but it's the marathon where we all can win. So it's been very intentional, the branding and the transitioning, because this is it. Like, I don't know if I will actually make my television shows because I've lost 2 years now. My best hope, and I'm part, 50% of the breadwinning in the family here, is I have to keep building this as a business and a career, and for people to discover my stories in a way where I can support the family.
So you developed this brand, as you say. We don't want to make you sound overly Machiavellian, because obviously your heart and your mind were in the right place. But you did develop this brand as an anti-lockdown activist, an advocate for truth during the COVID-19 pandemic in BC. And let's face it, where you were living was sort of a ground zero for COVID-19. It's a pretty locked down environment where you were living. But this really became, your activism really took on an anti-authoritarian stance, didn't it? And I'm speaking about, for example, your stance over the use of public parks in BC, your opposition to vaccine passports, and also digital currency regimes. And I wanted to ask you about this because, it's one thing to go out and be against masking or social distancing or things like that. But it seems to me, and I want to get your take on this, what really frightened the people who, let's say, were running the COVID-19 agenda about you is that you seem to have an understanding of the bigger game, of the broader anti-authoritarian or the broader authoritarian agenda that COVID-19 was being used to achieve. And you really communicated that by touching on some of these bigger issues, right? So when you go and you're talking about a public park being shut down, you're not only talking about the use of the park by children, you're putting that in the context of this is authoritarianism. This is where it starts, and this is where we could go. Am I correct, sort of, in understanding your worldview and why you sort of focused on things, the grassroots things like parks?
Well, two things, I guess. One is, like you, I grew up in the 70s. Like, we didn't have seatbelts in the cars, right? So right. I'm of the generation that believes, no, the government does not tell me what to do. Sorry, the government serves us. And I lived like that for 20 years with courtesy, like you said, mostly a courtesy government obliging, the wishes of the public. It used to be like that, right, before the 90s. So I already had that as my mindset. I had 12 years watching abusive authoritarian regimes destroy people's lives in Africa. So I knew what it looked like. I knew what the game was. But it was probably more because when I started seeing things, and the park is that good example. I was in a huge park when it was shut down, when the guys showed up with their caution tape and everything to shut down the park, and they said, everybody out. And most people just were like, okay, and they all left. And because I'm that curious person with the taking pictures and stuff, I was like, I wonder what this is about. So I went over and I started talking to them. I said, can I ask you why? And I've always done what's called témoignage. I was trained in témoignage, and témoignage means to bear witness. I was trained in New York City by Doctors Without Borders to go and work in the Blood Diamond War, and literally to bear witness and photograph human rights abuses in the war. And so I've always approached life like that. Ask questions, learn, make an opinion, notice things that are going around, take a few pictures. And the guys that were shutting down the park, the Richmond city employees, they were pissed off. They did not want to talk to me. They didn't want to shut down the park. They were upset that they were being forced to do this. They said a couple of things to me like that. And I was like, They're being forced to do something they don't want to do. And so because I had just been curious and I hadn't left the park, I suddenly had access to a whole other piece of information. I was like, what's going on inside city governments? So it wasn't necessarily because just being prone to anti-authoritarianism. I was always getting the inside story. I knew that there was massive pharmaceutical corruption in BC because I had been fighting it in my kids' school for a year before. So when the passport, they started talking about the vaccines, it's like, I was like, oh, it's these shareholders. That's why I really spoke out, why I built this brand, right? Why I did everything was I thought, I just happened to be one of the people right now in Canada, and there was probably thousands of us, who had all of the data in front of me. I just happened to have all these experiences that put it all together. I was really, really lucky. And with my husband, we figured it all out within the first month. And I thought, I have to warn people. I can't just let this happen because people are going to be harmed. I have to warn people. So the more I kept asking questions, the more I kept photographing. I ran into a guy, I'll just say this one more thing because you might want to have some more questions. And I was carrying a protest sign that said public health fraud. And I knew it was about financial, it's always about money, right? These crimes, they're always about money. Fair enough. And most people know that. And it said public health fraud. And I was walking to a protest and I was stopping to purchase something from a woman who was selling clothes on the street because her boutique had been forced to close. And I said, okay, I'll give you $20 to help her out, right? So he came over and he goes, what's with that sign? And I said, what do you mean? I'm on my way to a protest. And he goes, tell me about that sign. And so I said, okay, let me ask you first who you are and what the context of your understanding is, because that's really important, right? And to be open and to have a discussion. And he goes, well, I'm one of the engineers at Children's Hospital. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to ask you a question. Is this pandemic and what we're in the middle of right now, is it called a simulation? And there was dead silence. There's about 10 of us. And everybody looked over at him and he looked at me and he said, yes, it's a simulation. Because I knew that he would know that term because that's what the employees inside hospitals were told, that when it first came out, the pandemic was a simulation. It was practice. It was fake. It was all fake. And so to me, that was massive evidence that a children's hospital engineer admitted to me on the street that the pandemic was nothing more than a simulation. So I went to 5 hospitals and I photographed them and they were all empty and quiet. Wow. So it's probably that thrust to be curious. Just what's over there? Open that door. What's behind that door? It can save your life.
Your curiosity, though, drew the attention of people who didn't like how curious you were being, and you've become the target of some ad hominem attacks, haven't you?
Yeah, death threats. People coming to my house. I believe that I had sniffer dogs because I was living on this farm and something really weird happened one day. That was about a week before we booked our tickets to get out of the country. Because I thought, okay, if I am remotely correct and these dogs are here and there was a stranger on the property, because they would be looking for some people. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they weren't looking for me. But look what they just did to Arthur and Randy Hillier, right? They forced Randy into arrest. And I saw that coming last August. And I thought, if anything starts to happen to us, and I follow Steve Donzinger's work. You probably know him from New York, the human rights. Mm-hmm. And I was like, it's not too far of a stretch to think that something could happen to someone like me. I can't just pretend. I think, I'm free of this. I'll be fine. Maybe I won't be fine. And that's why we left the country.
So really, you fled Canada?
Absolutely, yeah. And I didn't tell anybody when we were going. I didn't have any goodbyes, or I didn't want anybody knowing the dates, the times, the airline, nothing. I shared nothing. And you'll love this. The moment we were about to walk through that hallway to get on the airplane, you hand them the paperwork and you go through that little thing to the fuselage. Out of nowhere, 2 border guards with guns showed up and they stood right there and they were staring at me. And I was like, oh my God, are they going to stop me? And my kids and everybody, they were all on the plane. I was like, I put my head down and I had my bag and I just walked right past them. And I thought, are they going to grab me? And they didn't. They actually stopped a Chinese woman behind me. It was obviously more trouble than I was, but it just got to be like that. If I had stayed, I don't know if I would have gone all the way from Vancouver to Ottawa, but to Merrill-Leach, that was me. That easily could have been me. And who knows what's coming for her, right? I've just heard that there's more charges that they're putting against her.
Right. This is the new Canada, where political dissidents are treated like criminals. This is the new reality. I don't accept it as the new normal, and I know you don't either. One thing, though, that is to your credit, Susan, is that although you left Canada, you're still very much engaged in what's going on in your home country, and you're still trying to make a difference. And you've discovered very active ways of doing that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Some of the things that you're involved in, where you're still trying to influence events in Canada to deal with this, which you've described, I think, quite aptly as a betrayal.
Yeah. So part of the reason to leave was to be able to keep advocating, right? I thought I will be more effective outside the jurisdiction of Justin Trudeau than sitting in a prison cell. And also being, terrified and depressed all the time. I knew that I would have a really hard winter watching all this stuff in Canada. So, and that's very common, right? And I've lived and worked internationally, and I know the bilateral power. The first thing I did when I arrived here was I called Ralph Goodell's office, who's the minister or the, ambassador to Canada in London, and said, "Hi, I'm going to seek asylum. I've escaped Justin Trudeau." And it really does work. The international part of the pressure is, as we saw from Christine Anderson and other people, you saw that in the parliament. This is a very, difficult piece of this now for Justin Trudeau, that the international community is putting pressure on him, because a lot of Canadians may still be really under kind of a media blackout, and they might not know how bad it is. So I'm a voice here, I'm a guest here, and I'm still waiting to be given my status. So I'm not doing much here, and it's not really my business. It's not my country. I'm supporting people, but my focus is my children. And now, after my book comes out, a copy of it will go with a request to have Justin Trudeau investigated by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And it seems like a big, big chance that even Reiner Fulmuck, who I'm in touch with regularly, says that that's not going to work. You never know. And this as a lawyer, you just never know. A little crack here, a little crack there, and boom, sometimes the gates, the floodgates of justice can't open. So there's a lot more I can do by being over here. And the main thing was to get out. I knew enough about the law to know that I had to get out of the jurisdiction of Justin Trudeau, because as long as I was living inside the borders of the nation that he governed as the leader, I was going to be subjective to whatever power he has authority to give. And I had to literally get out of the border. So it was like exile, asylum, refugee. That's really what it is. Just crossing that border. If I had just gone to Washington State, it would have worked. But my husband's British and he wanted to come back here. We used to live here. So It's an honor to do this with Canadians. I've been raising money for Canadians. I share all my stuff. I try and connect them to international interviewers to get the story told here. There's a ton of stuff that you can do outside the country. And even for someone like you, I would love to help you find international guests. They're all talking about Canada over here.
Well, this is I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that I really wanted to ask you about. You're quite right about the media blackout that exists here, and it's a very what you give is a very enlightening perspective. Just looking, I'm sure you've seen just from social media, there was sort of this collective cry of thank you that many Canadians expressed when they heard the comments, for example, of Ms. Anderson and others who openly criticized and really chastised Justin Trudeau in the European Parliament. But can you describe being in England, how big a deal it is in terms of what Justin Trudeau is doing? Because it's hard for us. We're sort of in the Canadian bubble. Of course, the mass media tries to color this over. Just to give you one example, I don't know if this story was in England, but it was actually suggested by Mr. Butts. You know who that is. That all the members of the European Parliament fled the gallery before Mr. Trudeau's speech for reasons because they were concerned about COVID. If you can imagine that sort of fallacious stuff is in our media, and of course they think that all of us are really stupid. I know everyone who listens to my show is intelligent, and that's why they're here. But can you just give us a sense of how strong these sense is that what Mr. Trudeau is doing is fundamentally wrong and anti-democratic?
Yeah, well, the great tradition, great British tradition of intellectual debate and justice is alive and well all over the country. And I live in the north, in a lower income area of the country, the old mining area, and everybody hates the government anyway and always has. So that's good, right? Nobody trusts the government, even if the government isn't doing anything wrong. It's part of their culture to mistrust government, and that's good, and that's healthy, right? And then a lot of British people have a relative or two in Canada. So they're getting direct stories. They're shocked. They're really, a lot of them, they either don't know what's going on in Canada or they're disgusted. And then down in London, where a lot of my friends and colleagues live and they do their, legal activism, and there's always big things going on. The Canadian embassy is constantly being protested against in London. Trudeau, big protests when he went to go see Boris. He had to go in a side door. So they've pieced it together, that Canada, I think, and you may have an opinion on this, is, I don't know, I think it's kind of the heart of the whole COVID financial reset system because of the patents around the injections, Trudeau being a very powerful part of the G7. I think the G7 really has been cooking this up, that the fact that we were Trump's neighbor. And so much of this, I think it had to do with Trump getting in, and this whole old system was really, the apple cart got upset because Trump got in. So the first person they called was Canada, because we are the neighbor of the United States that could turn against him, with the border being shut, all that power. So the British, it's funny because they're so traditional and they're so polite and whatnot in some ways, but at the same time, they will fiercely defend your right to have a different opinion. Like, people do masks and they believe things and they do vaccines or whatever. My hairdresser, and I have lots of people I talk to on a day-to-day basis, but nobody has ever said to me, you should do it because I want you to do it. They all say, oh God, no, of course, it's up to you. It's your right. And that's the old connection to the old society of British society, right? Being revolutionary and surviving all these things. We don't have that in Canada. We've never had to fight for our freedom. As you say, there's sort of a privilege there. And 30% of the mainstream media budgets are now funded by Ottawa. I didn't know that. A journalist told me that because they were broke. So there's that. That doesn't happen. There's a lot of older journalists here, over the age of 50, who are constantly criticizing the government. And we've lost a lot of that in Canada. Most of the journalists you read these stories by, especially the ones that did hit pieces on me, they're under the age of 35. So they don't even know what the 1970s or even what the 80s were like.
Right. We don't have enough Rex Murphys.
Yeah, our demographics are really bad in Canada, right? It's aging. It's very multicultural. All these foreigners coming from different countries, they're not going to speak out. They won't. And where I lived in Vancouver, it's full of foreign families. Nobody's going to speak out. So a lot of the demographics of how our country has changed in the past 30 years are working against us now, I feel, in terms of our democratic institutions.
Well, these are very, very fascinating perspectives, and I'm very grateful for them. Susan, I know that we don't want to keep you too much longer. We're very grateful for your time and for your insights. One thing that we do on our program, and I expect you're going to be able to help us quite a bit with this, is if you were going to direct people who are consuming this podcast to a book or a website or another source of information that could perhaps further their understanding of some of the topics that you raise in your book or some of the topics that we've discussed during our discussion here, what would they be? What would you recommend to people? Can you give us kind of a reading list or a shopping list of places they could go?
Yeah, absolutely. So I always talk about sort of advocacy, you call it activism or advocacy, as being a three-legged stool. And there's three things that everybody has to do on a regular basis. And you really have to do all three. One of them is researching. So connect to groups that are really heavy on the research. And so a lot of that a group could be Action for Canada. They're heavily researched. They've got a ton of volunteers in groups all across the country. Vladislav Sobolev, who started the movement when I did in Toronto, he's just launched a new initiative called Activate Canada or something, and it's training for advocates and tons of research and science behind that. The other leg, the second leg, is mobilizing groups. So it doesn't matter if it's just a book club in your house, if you're a suburban mom, or you're going to launch a big movement like I did. You have to get other people to help you to learn and to grow and to advocate together. You just might want to make your school better. You might want to run for, be it your city council, whatever. You have to mobilize people like management and business. You have to lead and mobilize. And those are a whole bunch of other groups all across Canada. My friend Marcella, Stand United, she's constantly doing events and training and teaching people how to do that. And then finally, the work that you do, the legal work is important. That third leg there, we have to have reform. And so there's one group in particular that really needs some help right now. They're looking for people to sign, I guess they call it a petition. If we get enough Canadians to sign this, the legal team in London, England, is going to initiate a motion in the British House of Commons to release Canada from monarchical rule. We actually need the British Parliament to do this so we can not be ruled by the Crown. This could be the biggest shift we need. It might be one of the only shifts we need. If we can remove the Crown and the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen, as the head of state, and it's not like she comes over and tells us what to do, but we have to have that mechanism changed. If the British Parliament says yes, and it's a really good time now because William and Kate just came back from this disastrous tour of the Caribbean where everyone was saying, oh my God, they look like the old colonialists, free us now. Barbados has pulled out of the Commonwealth. It's a very, very good time for them to release Canada from Crown rule. And then we reinstate citizens as the head. So to me, that's the biggest piece. We need millions of people on that. And that group is called the Canadian People's Union. It's run by a woman who's been doing this work for 13 years. She's in Saskatchewan. Her name is Nicole, and her partner is Rhonda Quinar. And they're doing something that not very many people are actually going to understand. It's very sophisticated, but it's fascinating. And it's the kind of stuff that we should be talking about around the dinner table. It's the kind of stuff that we did talk about around the dinner table when I was growing up. So there's 3 different ideas. And if you wanted me to drop those specific links somewhere, just let me know where. I've got dozens more ideas. There's amazing things happening now.
If you could please share them with Devin, we'll make sure that they're made part of the links when this interview is made available. That's a very fascinating viewpoint, and I have to say, quite honestly, I was not aware of that particular legal argument, even though. I'm trained in Canadian constitutional law. I had thought that the Statute of Westminster of 1931, and then with the repatriation of our Constitution back in 1982, that those had effectively released Canada from monarchical rule. So I'd be very, very interested to learn more about what you just were talking about.
You're correct.
And I'd like to share that with our, with the audience. When I learn more about it, I'd like to share that and perhaps have the petition put right on the program when we air this interview.
Yeah, and interview Nicole, right? She's the one, and you are correct. You're correct mostly, but there's one piece, and I'd have to read it again a couple of times to be able to speak on it properly. There's still one little piece that needs to be changed, and it might have to do with the Bill of Rights. It's one little tiny piece. But I tell you, oh my God, this woman has done nothing for 13 years, except this.
Well, and
she really knows what she's doing.
Right. Well, that's
okay.
and it's encouraging.
Like I said,
actually.
We've got. Well, it's a real thing, right? And that's probably what you want to help people find is we can talk about all the problems and the betrayal and the sad stories, but at the end of the day, Canadians are such action-oriented people and they're good people. They're like, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And we always have to offer them simple, meaningful solutions depending on where they live, what kind of resources they are. Some people have a lot of money and they can help with money. Some people have no money. Some people can write. We need things in schools. And I see a great renaissance really underway in Canada. I think that over the next 20 years, people like you weren't doing a podcast last year, right? We're just completely transforming our culture into one where justice is an everyday part of what we do. And that, again, that is why I built this brand. And it's not about like me being the face of it. Maybe one day people won't know who I am, but I recognized really immediately that we needed to bring back this mainstream notion that everybody is involved with justice and governance and democracy, because we've been pushed out of it for 30 years and told, we'll just leave it to this small group of powerful people. And then we end up getting bossed around.
Well, I share your optimism about the future of Canada. I really think that the best days are ahead of our country if we do the right things and we take the right actions. And that's really what I admire very much sincerely about your story and what you're doing, is that you're a person of action. You're taking action. You're not just talking about theories and you're not pie in the sky, intellectual concepts. Not that you're any kind of dunce. Obviously, from listening to you, there's a very active intelligence there and a very widely read, knowledgeable person. And of course, that only informs your advocacy and your activism. I want to recommend to people your book. Obviously, if it's half as interesting as listening to you is, it's going to be a great read. Where can people find the book, Susan? Is it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or do they have to order it off your website?
Yeah, they order it directly from me on the site. So the first print run comes out next month. The copies haven't started shipping. This is just, I need this for the printer. It's sizing and artwork and stuff. So as of April, I pre-sold some to cover all the costs of the printing, which was great. The first couple hundred come out and start shipping late April. And then what I've done instead was I built a site called Story by Susan just to feature the book. So people can go there, storybysusan.com. And I'm actually looking for Canadians, maybe women and moms or anybody who want to make some money. I'm not going to put it on Amazon. I'm going to try and build a grassroots distribution network. And I built a website because I have a tech background that if you can help me sell a book, a buyer can put your name on it and the person will get a referral fee. So I don't want to give the money to Amazon and these big companies because that's part of our problem, right? We have to have our own economy. And even some of these activism groups, if they could help me sell a couple of hundred books on tables this spring and summer, then they could make $500 or $1,000 and pay for speakers. So that's my plan right now. And it's just a matter of getting the 500, 1,000 units ready to go. And then I'll start probably printing it in Canada. So it'll be cheaper to ship. But at the moment, it's on my tea site. The e-commerce part of my tea site is healthjusticeteas.com. It's $25, $10 shipping from England. And then the second site where more of the information about the book is storybysusan.com. I wanted to recommend one more book for people to, sure. Not necessarily, it's not light reading, it's hard, but if I can just quickly show this to you, you may even be interested. The international criminal justice tool for us is very real for Canadians. And this guy, William Shaughnessy, he teaches in Middlesex, which is London, and he's Canadian. And so this thing is huge. He is one of the experts on the International Criminal Court. This is the 6th version, and it's all about how the International Criminal Court works. And the reason why I think it's really important is the crimes and the injustices that we're seeing right now, no court has ever had to deal with them. So you can't just go, oh, it's one of those global pandemic crimes. Okay, we know how to handle that one. Everybody's just going, what is this? And so the International Criminal Court was set up when Chrétien was Prime Minister between 1998 and 2002. And a huge amount of Canadians have a lot to do with that. So we have a lot of intellectual prowess in Canada that understand international law and international justice systems. And we can really be a leader in that, like we were 20 years ago. We can be a leader again, because will all be international crimes. That's what it is. It's international corporations. It's companies and individuals who are more powerful than nation states. So we have to start playing and advocating in international court systems as well to stop them and to hold them accountable, because our state systems aren't powerful enough, or it doesn't necessarily apply because the crime happened in a different country, but we're victims of it in Canada. So I do think that international law and international criminal justice is going to be a major tool for us going forward to stop these crimes of globalism, so we can be left alone. And I'm trying to make that something that's attractive for the average person to get their brain around. Because a lot of times, especially women, we think, oh, well, it's a bit intimidating, right? How could I couldn't understand that. I couldn't get involved, but it's absolutely accessible for every Canadian.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of women, and this is something that we didn't get into today, but I'd love to have you back and talk about more particularly, is how some of these justice issues seem to be targeting women. Things like, for example, the transgender movement, how it seems to be a particular attack on women. We could get into, for example, talking about Leah Thomas, or talking about, for example, the brave stand that someone like J.K. Rowling is making. But it does seem to me that some of these justice issues are really frighteningly targeting women. Just today, I was reading about a woman in Alberta who went to register her child's birth and could not put on the child's birth certificate that she's a mother.
I know.
She had to put down
Now,
that she's a birthing person. It seems to be some of these justice issues are really targeted on women. And that's a longer conversation than you can get into today, because I know you've got some time constraints. I'd love to have you back and talk more about that.
No, let me tell you a quick theory right now, but we can talk about it. Do you have a theory of why this is happening? Because I do, and I think it's real, and I'm curious to know, because you've picked up on the pattern. It's a pattern, and the patterns are never coincidences. Why do you think it's happening?
I think that the patriarchy that has been the sort of the patriarchy theory that someone like Jordan Peterson debunks quite a bit is a drum that radical feminists have been beating for a long time. I think it's a distraction. I think it's distracting women, women of knowledge, women of substance, from the true attack that is coming upon womanhood, upon the family. Because of course, women, I don't think I'm offending anybody to say this, the mothers are the core of the family. We call this Mother Earth for a reason. Every story, every origin story on Earth has as its root some story about motherhood. And it happens to be a fact, and I'm going to offend some people here, that women have this magical superpower, and that is that they can create life. And well, I think you asked me the question. So just finish this thought, and I'm going to see what you think of this. I think that men are envious of women for that reason. I think men have always been envious of women for that reason. I think this is at the heart of the conflict, this sexual conflict. I don't see the story in the West of men and women as being as a Marxist class struggle. I see it more in terms of men and women collaborating throughout history to fight off a planet that's trying to kill us. And I think fundamentally that's the real story of the relationship between men and women. But I think that there is a very radical agenda that is out to disempower women, because if that is done, if that is achieved, if we destroy something like motherhood, we've destroyed the fabric of Western society and culture. So that's my 10-cent view. What's yours?
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you. And I would say that is the large, big umbrella view, right? And you can add in what is happening with women in cultures like Afghanistan, the removal of rights and powers. But I have a one specific piece to add to that I think is very real. And before COVID, I had researched and spent 2 years working with animal rights activists. And I'm mostly vegan. I just don't really like eating the animals. I feel so sorry for them. And one thing that was apparent right away was the exploited animals are the females, right? 90% of the food in the industrial food agriculture system are females. So when all the chicks are born, like there's 1,000 chicks, they separate the baby male chicks, they throw them through a grinder, and then they preserve and grow the females. And so I believe a lot of this is actually about the fact that women have reproductive systems. That's the one thing that we can do that men can't do. And there is definitely a depopulation agenda. And so controlling and destroying the reproductive systems, definitely controlling it, I think is a big part of this. You're right about the spiritual and the power, and we'll always speak out. But I actually specifically think it's a lot more about the physiology. And
it certainly would explain why, for example, the government of Canada. Yeah, no, that's very insightful. And it would explain, for example, why in the midst of the pandemic, the government of Canada sent almost $1 billion to fund abortions in Africa.
There you go, stuff like that. Yeah. So it's reproductive targeting, and I would love to talk about that. And you see it everywhere, right? And even in America, a huge disproportionate example of Black women that are given abortions. It's there, and it's a theme and whatever. So you're right. Like your answer is better because it's more all encompassing. But the stuff that I would stick to and focus on would be something more like the reproductive agenda. And like I even saw a sign, it's not a new sign, and the animal rights activists used to talk about all this time. It drove me nuts. It said, stop having children. Like there's this even blatant propaganda campaign not to birth. So, well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I also want to be able to promote the company that's your sponsor that makes the t-shirt and the supplement, whatever. So I'll have to get that information from you and I can share it and order some stuff.
Well, I'll be certain that you get a complimentary basket for your appearance today. We're very grateful to have met you and listened to you. I'd love to have you back again because I feel like we've just scratched the surface of the things that we could talk about. But thank you on behalf of all of the viewers. I don't speak for all Canadians, but I think I can speak for our viewers for the work that you're doing on behalf of Canadians, and for your courage and for your writing and for all that you do and for sharing some of your heart and your mind with us today. The goal of this program, as you can probably guess, is to produce a deep and meaningful conversation in which people can listen and engage as though they were sitting at a table with hopefully some smart people, which you are obviously one, and engage in a meaningful conversation. They can take something away that's useful. And I think we've certainly achieved that today, mostly because of your participation. So we're very grateful for you spending some time with us today.
Thank you. Yeah. And good luck to you. This is wonderful. I wish you all the best and I'll help you in it, whatever way you need.
Thank you, Susan. The book is Betrayed. She's told you how to order it. If you need more information about that, we are happy to provide it. Thank you, Susan.
Okay.